Good evening, gentlemen. Today, God willing, we start our discussion of the fourth chapter of the Holy Tanya. We have done the introduction, chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3. Now, God willing, we are beginning chapter 4. Those with a long memory will remember that our class began Chol HaMoed Sukkos was our first class on Tanya. So we are making very good time. We're not back to Sukkos yet, and we've already done 3 whole chapters plus the introduction. It's not bad. Hurtling through the chapters of the Tanya. This in summary. The introduction to Tanya and the first page was all about how the Tanya is not really a book. The Tanya is the Alter Rebbe written down and given over, a direct connection with the Alter Rebbe. It's a very special book in very lofty and holy ways. The front page of Tanya, the very first page, says what the point of the book is. The point of the book is to understand how it's very close to serve God in your mouth and in your heart to do it. In other words, that every single person should be able to serve God. And this is really the question that the person is asking the Alter Rebbe. The question that Tanya is answering is, I'm an observant Jew, I follow all the rules, I do what an observant Jew is meant to do, but I don't feel like I'm really serving God. I don't feel the presence of God. I don't feel the reality of God. I don't have love and fear of God. My service of God doesn't feel real. It doesn't feel truly like I'm truly connecting with God. Maybe I just feel like I'm doing things by rote, or because I was educated that way, or it seems like a good thing to do, or I know it's a good thing to do, but it doesn't always feel like it's a good thing to do. Where is God in Judaism? Right? That's basically the question to the Alter Rebbe. And to this question, as the Alter Rebbe writes in the introduction, the Tanya is a response to questions, the questions of every Jewish soul, that every Jewish soul wants to know about how to have a true love and fear of God in an authentic and an inner way that's transformational, that a person should have a living and authentic service of God. The Alter Rebbe writes the Tanya. The first, as we mentioned many classes ago, the first 12 chapters of Tanya are, in a way, simply an anatomy of the soul. They're diagnostic chapters. Before we get to what to do and how to do it and what it means to serve God and how a person serves God, a person has to know what they are. Fundamental, right? It's impossible. The Alter Rebbe cannot help you if your understanding of the soul, or as it turns out, souls multiple, is stuck in your base assumptions, is stuck in your within your worldly limitations. The advice of the Alter Rebbe is not going to help. So first, a person needs an education. A person needs to understand what we're dealing with, what the goal is, right? And only then can we move on to all of the practical concerns that most of the Tanya addresses. So the beginning of Tanya is all it's what we may call in the modern parlance, it's an information dump. Right? Alter Rebbe is saying, here's how it is. That's the first 12 chapters. Later, we'll get to, but how do I deal with it? So what do I do? How, therefore, shall I live? That's all later. The first 12 chapters of Tanya is the Alter Rebbe is just telling you, and it's in very much in a way of take it or leave it, right? As we've explained before, that since the assumption of Tanya is that you're coming and you want the Alter Rebbe to help you, so he's not here to convince you of anything. He's just going to tell you how it is, and that's the way it is, right? You want my help? I'm going to tell you how it is. That's the first 12 chapters of the Tanya. So, Chapter 1 says, the beginning of Chapter 1 introduces a whole bunch of questions, which we're going to only answer later, questions concerning the nature of tzaddik, rasha, and beinoni, and various other things in the service of God, which is all at the beginning of Chapter 1, the answers to which are all later in Tanya. The Alter Rebbe says, in order to understand that, we first have to discuss the two souls of a Jew, which this is a conversation we're in the middle of, and we're going to continue for several more chapters. This discussion that was began in chapter 1 about the two souls of a Jew. So a Jew has two souls. Chapter 1 was introducing the animal soul. The animal soul, fundamentally, as we discussed at length in chapter 1, the core of the animal soul, the spiritual core of the animal soul is I am. Right? It is the separate existence from God. It is the sense, it is the declaration that I exist. That's the core of the animal soul. The second chapter of Tanya introduces the godly soul. And now we're doing chapters all about the godly soul. We're only going to get back to the animal soul in chapter 6. So first chapter is an interesting order that itself requires study. Why the Alter Rebbe wrote the book this way, we spoke about it a little bit previously. But the Alter Rebbe wrote the book in such a way where the first chapter is the animal soul. Then there's a whole bunch of chapters, 2, 3, 4, and 5 about the godly soul. And only in chapter 6 do we go back to the animal soul. So we're in the so chapter 2 is we start talking about the godly soul. And the chapters are very well organized. Each chapter has its own, is talking about its own aspect of the godly soul and in order. So chapter 2 begins with, what is the godly soul? Simple question, right? The Manis Friedman, Rabbi Manis Friedman, the great Chabad lecturer and educator, in many of his talks, always talks about how the true smartest son at the Seder is the Ben Tam, is the simple son, because his question is, Mazos, what is this, right? If you answer the question, what is this, you can answer all other questions. The fundamental question is, what is the thing, right? The answer to what is the godly soul is God saying I am within the Jew. The animal soul is something else saying I am, is an I separate from God saying I am. The godly soul is God saying I am within the Jew. It is God's statement of I am. Not the statement to the Jew, but the statement that the Jew is. The Jew has a life force and a full vitality and a full self that is the statement of God saying, I am. Which is a fancy way of saying that the godly soul is a chelek eleika mimal mamash. It is a part of God above, literally. And as we discussed previously, the godly soul is fundamental and is key to the understanding of the Alter Rebbe's entire approach to Judaism. It is impossible to understand the Alter Rebbe's approach to Judaism and the way the Alter Rebbe understands the service of God without understanding that the godly soul is real and is within the Jew, is the Jew's fundamental identity, is their second soul, and is literally a part of God above. Because, as we explained in previous classes, the function of the godly soul is that we do not know God only from the outside. The animal soul, because it is defined as I am, only ever knows God even in the most righteous and most holy and most wise. Animal soul only knows God as a separate being, to the extent that anything can be separate from God, which that's a Shayichut V'Emunah issue, maybe. We'll discuss that more later. The extent anything can be separate from Hashem, but the animal soul, at least in its own fundamental perception, and this perception, Chassidus would tell you, is the existential core of the animal soul. In other words, if you got rid of this perception, there would be nothing left, which may be a good idea. Maybe that's the right thing to do. That's a question for a different time. But the fundamental core of the animal soul is its perception of its own I am, is its sense, I exist, the declaration, I am separate from God. And inasmuch as that declaration exists as the existential, pre-rational, spiritual core of the animal soul, right? It's not a rational thought. It's before all the rational thoughts of the animal soul. All the thoughts of the animal soul all derive from this spiritual, pre-rational I am. It's its existential core. It's what it means for it even to exist, is this I am, as we discussed at length in chapter 1. So that soul will never know God from the inside. The way it works towards God is always going to be in a stepwise fashion. It has to work towards God from a place of distance. And the fact is that God, in truth, cannot be reached from the outside. God can't be reached in the way in the depth of the way Chassidus says is possible to reach God. God cannot be reached from the outside in this fashion. God cannot be reached as an approach from the outside. And even as we may discuss soon, actually, it's sort of germane to our chapter, even though as we may discuss soon, you have a concept of God reaching down and closing the gap, perhaps, by giving us mitzvahs and giving us Torah of himself, the animal soul, as we're going to see in the coming chapters, the animal soul can't really use those either. Those are also, the animal soul, because it is an I am, its entire access, even to Torah and mitzvahs, is tainted and is to some extent ruined by its own sense of I am. Right, as we're going to discuss later, that even when the animal soul understands Torah, it understands it from the outside, not from the inside, which means that it will never truly understand it from the same perspective as God, etc., as we'll discuss later. So, fundamentally, the animal soul and God are facing each other, one below and one above, and they are actually fundamentally separate. If you remove the separation, you would destroy the animal soul. There would be nothing left. The godly soul is the principle that we are never separate from God in the first place, right? The godly soul says there is it's something that is defined not by being itself, but by being nullified to God. It's defined not in separation, but in unity. It's defined as God saying, I am. And therefore, when this Jew is coming and asking the Alter Rebbe, how do I have a true relationship with God? A lot of the response to that is going to be in the recognition, the strengthening, the augmenting of the godly soul. Because the fact is you cannot establish a relationship with God from the outside. But your relationship, the good news is a Jew's relationship with God is inherent and from the inside. And we're working from that place of inherent and fundamental connection, we can draw that into our conscious reality, our awareness, our day-to-day life. And the godly soul is therefore the key to connecting to God and having an authentic relationship with God. Because if to the animal soul a relationship with God is not authentic, it's imposed, fundamentally. Right? The truth is all things are related to God, but the animal soul fights against that with every fiber of its being. It doesn't, if it really knew its own relationship to God, it wouldn't exist again, right? To repeat that point. Therefore, the godly soul, you may even put it in this pop psychology way, the godly soul is not threatened by a true relationship with God. Authentic relationship with God does not threaten the godly soul and is therefore possible with the godly soul. The godly soul is the key to the Alter Rebbe's entire understanding of Judaism. The second chapter establishes what is the godly soul. It's literally a piece of God above. Every Jew, as an inheritance from our holy forebears, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because we are Jewish, inherent to the Jewish national identity, which if you think about it, when we spoke about this, I believe in chapter 2, that the Jewish national identity is about chosenness and a fundamental historical relationship with God, where God stepped into history and took us out of Egypt, etc., right? That fundamental identity, the Jewish identity, which a sociologist might think is a sociological identity like any other, the Alter Rebbe says the sociological reality of the Jew is wrapped around a metaphysical identity of the Jew. The Jew is not just someone who happens to be a descendant of a people claiming special relationship with God. On the contrary, God made them from the inside as having a special relationship with Him. There is a special spiritual inheritance of the Jew where he has a special connection with God, which is called the godly soul. Chapter 3, which we just finished, then moved on, and we asked what is the godly soul in chapter 2. In chapter 3's question is kind of like, okay, but what is it really, right? In the sense of chapter 2's definition of the godly soul is a definition, so to speak, from God's perspective, right? From the inside, as we keep saying. Chapter 3 is asking the question, okay, but if you define something as literally a piece of God, God has no intersection with this coffee cup. He has no intersection with finite reality. I mean, obviously we know God does intersect with finite reality, but not in a way that we really understand, right? What does God have to do with the rational, mundane, limited, defined world in which we normally live. What would it even look like for God to enter into that reality? And the answer is it would look like miraculous and inexplicable things, right? He's not bound within that reality in the normal in the normal sense. All of this is more complicated, really, but the fundamental point is that if the soul is just a piece of God, if a godly soul is defined as just a piece of God, it's not clear how it could be a self in the normal definition of a self. A normal definition of a self is someone that you're able to have a conversation with, let's say, right? How could you have a conversation with a godly soul? It's literally just a piece of God. It's like, how can you have a conversation with God? Well, you can talk to God, right? But I don't know if he's a defined self within our reality exactly in that sense, right? You're talking to him and hoping that he's going to cross the infinite distance and listen to you, right? But if it was up to you to cross the infinite distance toward him, where would you even begin? Right? How do you start approaching God? So if the soul is just a piece of God, it's not clear how all of the functions we know it serves can be served. And therefore, chapter 3 explains further. It gives us the rational, finite definition of the godly soul. It says, yes, the godly soul is a piece of God. What does that mean in our finite reality, in the rational definition, the relational definition of the godly soul? The answer is the godly soul is seichel and midos. The godly soul is intellect and emotion. And because it's the godly soul, it's intellect that only thinks about God, and it's emotion that only feels about God. There's no this worldly idea and no this worldly feeling or emotion, attachment or detachment even, vis-a-vis the godly soul. The godly soul has only one relationship, and that relationship is with God. So the godly soul is, in a practical definition, that which thinks about God, knows God intellectually and profoundly, and has an emotional relationship with God. And as we explained in chapter 3, this is not treating God as a monolith, because it's not just chachma, which treats God absolutely simply. It's not just wisdom, which would approach simply the greatness of God as a single unified concept, but rather, because it's coming into emotions and coming into understanding and appreciation, bina, and into midos, this is a multifaceted, complex relationship with God, just like you would have with a person. Right? Where there's all different aspects of the person, all different things you can appreciate, and infinite depths and complexity. And so when we say the godly soul thinks about God and has an emotional relationship with God, we don't just mean in one-dimensional relationship. On the contrary, we're talking about all the complexities and all the details and all the levels and different ways in which God relates, which are really infinite. So the soul has no shortage of thoughts to think or emotions to feel about godliness alone. That's chapter 3. Chapter 3 is, what is the soul by the worldly definition of is? The answer is, it is a mind apprehending God and emotions relating to God. That's what the godly soul is, right? Or in the words of the Alter Rebbe, the godly soul is that which is on fire from the fact that about that which truly exists, and besides which nothing else exists at all. That's the definition of the godly soul, right? Chapter 4, Perek Daled of Tanya, continues this discussion, and we are bringing it down now to the next level. Chapter 3 ends, even though it's not really named explicitly for reasons we discussed in previous classes. Chapter 3, the last level discussed in chapter 3, the lowest level discussed in chapter 3, is what's called Malchus, is called the lowest of the 10 faculties of the soul, the lowest emotional quality, which is normally translated as kingship or majesty. And as we explained when we were discussing all 10 faculties, the function of Malchus is to pass on, is to be the connector and the bridge between the intellect and emotions and external reality. Malchus takes the emotional qualities of the soul, where the soul's emotions fundamentally are the contours and the shape of its relation to external realities. In the case of the godly soul, the external reality of God, right? Malchus takes that reality and it allows that relationship, that emotional and intellectual relationship with God, to be externalized, right? What does that externalization look like? That's chapter 4. Chapter 3 is what's called koiches, faculties of the soul, the 10 faculties of the godly soul. Chapter 4, if you summed it up in one word, the word is levushim, which means garments. Chapter 4 of Tanya is about the 3 garments of the soul, a famous topic of the Alter Rebbe, extremely critical to understanding the Alter Rebbe's whole approach to what is a Beinoni, and therefore what is the expectation of every Jew. What is every Jew expected to do? The answer is, or as we'll see, the answer involves the concept of thought, speech, and action, which are the 3 garments of the godly soul, and they are the topic of chapter 4. The topic of chapter 4 is about the 3 garments. In other words, the question of chapter 4, that chapter 4 answers is, what does the godly soul do? Chapter 2 is, what is the godly soul? Chapter 3 is, okay, but what is the godly soul by a worldly or a limited definition of is, like the way everything else is? What is the godly soul? Chapter 3 is, but what does it do? Right? And we're going to discuss, and in many ways, chapter 4 is really about what doing means. What is it? Why should there even be something that it does? Why is it important that it do anything? Right? Why isn't being better than doing? A question we'll get to in just a moment, actually. So the answer is that what the soul does is externalize its intellect and emotions in 3 different ways. It has 3 capacities, 3 abilities to externalize the intellectual and emotional relationship with God. Those 3 capacities are thought, speech, and action. And as we'll see when we read the first line of chapter 4, these are called levushim. These are called garments. Why are they called garments? Why are they called levushim? The first thing to understand, no one told this to me on my first day when I was learning Chassidus. I'm giving you the shortcut route because it took me a long time to, maybe it's because I'm particularly dull-witted, that's also possible, but when we say that the garment is a garment, Chassidus talks about garments a lot. When it's not talking about garments, it's talking about hislavshus. Levush is a garment. Hislavshus, which you can hear comes from the same root, hislavshus means in clothing. And in clothing, or becoming invested in, or enclothed in, is in probably the vast majority of all Hasidic discourses. Talk about some kind of verb, which means to become enclothed in. So for the most of the rest of today's class, I'd like to discuss what we mean, or at least a little bit. We may have discussed this a little earlier as well, but discuss again a little bit what we mean when we say hislavshus, what we mean when we say enclothing in garments. We touched on, when we were learning the first chapter of Tanya in particularly, we touched on the idea that the focus of Tanya is to rethink Judaism from the inside. From the inside is a critical way to understand the Tanya. Everything the Alter Rebbe is aiming at is at removing an understanding of things from the outside. It's easy to look at Judaism superficially, although from the outside it means more than just superficially. And on the contrary, that's kind of, in a way, almost the topic of our chapter. There's a way of looking at things from the outside. There's a way of looking at things from the inside. And Tanya, being all about pnimius, the inner reality of things, the inner reality of Judaism, looks at things from the inside. And you find this again and again. There's barely a chapter of the whole Tanya in any of the 5 parts that doesn't have to do with looking at things from the inside. What do we mean by from the inside in a Hasidic context? We've spoken before about how everything that exists has a body and a soul. Everything that exists has an inside and an outside. When we say inside and outside in this class, what we mean is body word versus soul word. Towards the body versus towards the soul of anything. Everything that exists in our reality, certainly, and in many higher realities as well, exists with a body and a soul. What does that mean? The truth is, it's hard to say. It's hard to say what that means. We have an intuitive grasp of the terms, which is why it's easier just to say everything has a body and a soul. What that actually means is more difficult. I think it means something like this. It has something to do with the idea that because in Chassidus, everything that, it's not really just Chassidus, in Judaism, right? Let's start from the fundamental principle. The fundamental principle is that God is the only true eternal reality. God himself, right? This is fundamental Judaism. This is monotheism, right? And the truth is, as we've discussed in this class previous times, this is really logically demonstrable. This is not really a mystical principle at all. On the contrary, it's more like basic human intelligence and basic Judaism. Although the contemporary mind has trouble accepting this for various reasons, because we are a lowly and orphaned generation. That is a different discussion for a different time. Suffice it to say, it is very obvious to most serious people who are able to think about it, which is not everyone, not all serious people, but most serious people who are able to think about it, it becomes fairly obvious fairly quickly that there can only be one true existence, right, on which all other existences depend. In the word, to paraphrase the beginning of the Mishnah Torah, the beginning of the Rambam's halachas, right? The Rambam says that the truth of all things derives from the truth of this original existence, right? There's one fundamental reality, and in some way, and the truth is you would be surprised probably how much leeway you have within this definition, how many different types of things you can come up with and argue about, of course, within this definition. But fundamentally, everyone agrees, and when I say everyone, I mean like all human societies of thinking human beings on the face of the earth, more or less, believe and agree that there must be one fundamental reality upon which all other realities depend for their existence, and it does not depend on anything, right? The buck stops here. There has to be one fundamental thing. After that, everything else is dependent. What does that mean? Chassidus says, and it's a very simple concept, really. It's so simple that it's applicable to everything, which is the point, right? Only the simplest things are applicable to everything. The more complex something becomes, the more limited its range, right? A very simple idea. The idea is that since God is the only true reality, everything other than God himself must possess an inherent duality, is the word in English. Everything other than God himself has at least two aspects. Why? It's very simple, because since everything that is brought into existence that is not God, right, must depend on God, this establishes a what's the word? It establishes a valence, would be the fancy word. Directionality, slightly less fancy, to all things, right? And it's very interesting because in the Kabbalah, there is a whole term and vast literature about the concept of directionality. It's called the Kav. And the Kav is the source of all realities outside of God. Yeah, it's called the vector or the ray. But the emphasis on kav, you don't have the full story of the kav, which is the ray, without the igul, which is what precedes it. Before the tzimtzum, the great withdrawal of God's presence, it doesn't matter if we don't really know what all of this means right now. I don't really know what all of it means either. But before the withdrawal of God's presence, there existed something called the infinite light. The infinite light is referred to as the igul. The igul means the circle. The circle has no directionality. Right? Before God creates, there's no directionality. Everything just is. The truth is that this too could be and is found to be not entirely true necessarily in every respect, etc. It's way above our pay grade. The after the tzimtzum, which means for our purposes, after God decides to create a world, very roughly. Right? The details don't really concern us right now. After God decides to create a world, it's all created through a divine reality called the kav, which kav is often translated as line. I think vector is closer. And even you could generalize and even say it's created through directionality. Because the point of a line is it runs in one direction, right? As opposed to a circle. A circle is infinite in that sense, right? There's the infinity of the circle. That's even why I believe we say in the reasons for Jewish customs why in the wedding we use a ring, right? The ring implies the eternality of the circle, right? The eternality of the bond. So everything that's not God, more or less, pretty much, everything that's not God himself has a duality. It has directionality. It's like a line. There's one side that's closer to God and one side that's further from God. Because everything that exists has to be what it is. What is this thing that exists? And whatever it is dependent on God. Which means there's two things. There's the thing and its relationship with God. This is the simple concept. It actually is very, very simple and absolute. Absolutely applicable to pretty much all things, more or less. Yeah? Everything is both what it is and dependent on God. And therefore, all things that are not God himself have a duality. They have two sides, at least. Right? Of course, most things are much more complicated. But everything has at least two sides, right? In our class, these two sides are what we're calling the inside and the outside. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason why it's better to call them, I have found, after much struggle, it's better to call them inside versus outside as opposed to, say, top versus bottom, right? Because if you're imagining God creating things as kind of a grand hierarchy, right, you could imagine God is at the top, right? And then there's as you go down. So there's the part that relates to God is the part that's higher or more towards the top, and you could say the other part is as it relates lower, right? It's very much like the famous Yiddish saying that every stick has two ends, right? Which is true, which is metaphysically true of all things. Everything has two ends, right? I think the meaning of that phrase is actually meant to be more like there's two sides to every story, which is also true. As anyone who studies the Talmud knows, it's very, very much the case. It's better to call them the inside versus the outside. The reason why it's better to call them the inside versus the outside, and here is where things become more subtle, right? Is because as you write Flannery O'Connor, you know who Flannery O'Connor is, right? She wrote a book called All That Rises Must Converge, right? Everything that goes, probably, I don't know when the last time was Flannery O'Connor was mentioned in a Tanya class. All that rises must converge. As you approach God himself, right? I'm explaining this to you in a very coarse way, but it is true, I believe, what I'm saying. Otherwise, I wouldn't be saying it. As everything converges towards God, right? Everything must become, ultimately, the self of the divine, for lack of a better term, right? God's very self. When we said there's that first existence, right? We believe that existence is a self. for reasons partially debatable, partially not really, and for a different time, a whole different thing. As everything converges, it converges on the divine self. This really has to do with the discussion we've had many times before about how existence is within God rather than vice versa, right? God is not a thing that has an existence. All existence exists within God, which means that the highest principle is the divine self, is the self of the divine, which can even perceive or create existence itself, right? So there's the self that precedes existence. So as things, see earlier classes for more discussion on this in review. I'm not sure where exactly we discussed this, but we discussed it multiple times. As everything gets closer to God, right? And remember, everything has a side that's closer to God. It approaches the inner reality of the divine self, where God is totally unto himself, right? What I mean by unto himself is that God is not in interaction. God is totally self-contained, right? Obviously, before anything else is created, God is just two. Yes? Following me roughly? Therefore, the higher side of the thing, right? If you have the thing and how the thing relates to God, how the thing relates to God is ultimately the inside of the thing. In other words, it's closer to the divine perspective on the reality of the thing. Because there is nothing that exists without reference to God and without dependence on God. Therefore, there is how it perceives itself is more external to it than how God perceives it. See what I'm saying? The reality of the thing, the deeper truth, the first aspect of the thing that there is the way God sees the thing. What follows is that the thing acquires perhaps a way of seeing itself, a way that it truly is. So let's talk about my coffee cup. My coffee cup in its self-perception, in its which I don't mean consciously. What I mean is in its self-contained being. When you say this is a coffee cup and nothing more, nothing less, right? That is more superficial than the way that the coffee cup depends on God. The way the coffee cup depends on God is the inside of the coffee cup, not physically, of course. The inside, meaning the inner reality of the thing, is how it depends on God. Because the coffee cup's, or the origin of its origin is God's perception of this reality, of a coffee cup, of this coffee cup. And how it is manifest to us as a self-contained thing only follows afterwards. It's further away from how God originally conceives of the thing, which the original conception of all things is absolutely united and totally one with God, which the coffee cup obviously is not. If anything isn't, then the coffee cup isn't. Sort of follow what I'm saying? It's a little bit subtle, but right? I'll put it a different way, maybe a more striking way, which is that we believe in Chassidus that God is closer to you than you are to yourself. And that is a generalizable principle of all things. Right? God is closer to you. Sorry?
That has to be.
Correct. It has to be. I agree. Exactly. 100% correct. In this whole system, in this whole way of looking at the world, God is closer to you than you are to yourself, because what you are to yourself is an effect, is the lower half, is the lower half of the duality. The higher half of the duality is God's relationship with you, which actually precedes you and is your source, Chassidus would tell you, is the root of your existence, right? So, given all of that, when we say everything has a body and a soul, here's what it comes out, right? So you have to put on the goggles, you have to put on the way of Chassidus is looking at the world, of the inner world and the outer world, right? This coffee cup is sitting on this table. Two objects are in interaction. There's lots of things we could say about these objects. Physics has a whole way of looking at this interaction. We'll get to physics maybe in a minute. It's part of a different rant. But these two objects are in interaction, right? We would say that most of what we see in the interaction of these two objects, most of what the human mind comprehends about them, including their sociological meaning, their physical meaning, the physical laws operating on their interaction, right? That the table is stable and the cup doesn't fall through it, which is actually because of the electromagnetic force. All different other things, right? It's gravity's trying to pull it down, but the electromagnetic surface tension among the particles of the table actually are able to hold it up against the pull of gravity, because gravity is very weak and electromagnetism is very strong. And all the other things that physics would tell you about these two things in interaction. The coffee that's inside the cup is slowly heating up the table, right? Because of the way that the molecules interact, et cetera, and all of their interactions. And then, of course, you have the aesthetic qualities of what an artist would tell you about this, and then you have the sociological realities of what a coffee cups mean to Americans, or what a tables mean to Americans, right? And all these different things, et cetera, with almost without end, right? You can find the human mind is incredible and is able to find incredible meaning in nearly all things, right? Beyond what Chassidus would say, that all of that is the outside of the thing. Why? Because you haven't mentioned God once, right? God has not entered into this picture. So when we say the outside of these two things are interacting, we don't mean physically the outside of these two things, right? There's a much deeper, it's a metaphor, it's a metaphorical language, right? These two things interact in the external universe. What we mean in the external universe is that the cup has come into being as a separate thing from God. The table, in whatever way, and I agree, it's an extremely convoluted and difficult to understand and difficult to see and difficult to appreciate process. But given that the cup came into being as a separate thing from God, and the table came into being as a separate thing from God, granting this assumption, right? The two of them in interaction as two independent objects with no reference to God can only be an external interaction, right? It's the lower half of one thing interacting with the lower half of the other, right? That's what we mean in this class when we talk about the outside world, the external world. These two things are in, so you can, and that's why we've said in this class previously that you can have an inner external world as well. Right? Because fundamentally, my feelings about this coffee cup are feelings. They're part of my inner world, so to speak, right? They're in my soul, Chassidus would say, right? My feelings about this coffee cup. But nevertheless, that doesn't make it the true inner reality any more than the coffee cup and the table being in interaction, right? This is a very confusing point, because this is something that really Chassidus is very radical about, whereas more standard ways of thinking, or even religious philosophies, are very different about this. More standard religious philosophies would say things like, your feelings towards the cup is really the inside, right? Whereas mere physical interaction is the outside. Chassidus says it's totally different. Inside is only godliness. Only godliness is the inner reality. Right? Anything that's not godly, anything that is not taking God into account in a true way, right? It's all external. Your feelings towards this coffee cup, with you as a finite, defined human being, as a thinking animal, a rational animal, as Aristotle would call you, interacting with this coffee cup, that's all outside, outer world, external world. Two things that have become separate things from God and are now interacting, so to speak, face to face on the outside, right? What's the inner world of these things? The inner world of these things is how they all emerge from God. And everything that rises converges. At some point, all things are one, right? That's why it's called Jewish mysticism. That's what all mysticisms have in common, right? Although whether we really feel comfortable with the word mysticism is, I'm happy to debate, because it has many connotations and many meanings that are totally foreign to real Yiddishkeit, and especially to Chassidus. But the point, the reason why they call it mysticism, the point of truth that's contained in that, the true aspect, right, is that all things that are mysticisms, all mysticisms are fundamentally based on the idea that everything is one, right? It's all about unity, really, all forms of mysticism, unless it's being used as like an epithet or an insult, right? But true mystical schools of mysticism, what really defines them, what unites all mysticisms, is the notion that all things are one, right? Which, by the way, if you wanted, you could read 1,000 Maimarim and find all the parts where Chassidus says everything is not one, and make a very good argument that it's not mysticism, because there's a whole half of Chassidus which is all about how things are not one, right? We don't believe things are one in a simple way. Let's put it that way. We believe things are one in a very subtle and complicated way, having to do with God, right? We believe that the cup and the table are truly distinct in almost every sense, except in their godly root. In that sense, they're united. So you could argue just as much from the other half that Chassidus is not a form of mysticism. But anyway, the inner world of these things is their root in God. That's the inner world of any given thing, right? And now we get to really the point of talking about all this in chapter 4. In the inner world, interaction is not two things interacting as two separate things. That's really the point. When things interact in the external world, they interact as two separate things. But the inner world tells us that all anything is a relationship with God, which means that all anything is really all ultimately connected. There's not two things, right? Let me give you an example. In Chassidus, when we talk about how the soul, in its much more inner state, and these are relative terms, of course, you can go higher and lower, it's all relative, right? As many things are in Kabbalah, right? It's inner in relation to something else, but it may be outer in relation to something else, is what I mean by relative. So we say in Chassidus that when your soul's ability of its five senses, we say in Chassidus, we haven't discussed senses in the Tanya. In fact, I can't even remember off the top of my head if Tanya ever discusses the five senses, which is very interesting. But elsewhere in Chassidus, it's discussed at length. And Chassidus would tell you that your soul's five senses are inherent to the soul. In other words, yes, you taste physical things in this world, right? But taste is not a physical process ultimately, right? Because your soul is experiencing the quality of a thing. So your soul fundamentally has an ability to taste. In other words, before you were born and incarnated, when your soul was this pure spiritual being in the treasury of souls, as it's described up above, your soul also had the ability to taste and to see and to hear, right? Chassidus discusses what it means.
That's not the same taste.
No, it's completely different. That's the point, right? That's the point of the whole chapter, in a way, even you could say. The soul is its above when it sees things, right? How does it see things? It doesn't see separate objects. Separate objects we can think of for our purposes as belonging to the external world, even though really this dichotomy is spiritual versus physical. But spiritual versus physical is a particularization of the general concept of soul versus body, more godly versus less godly, right? Not always, but in general. I hope you understand what I'm saying. The soul, as it is above, it sees things by seeing itself. No external relation, right? The soul sees things, which seeing, by the way, is connected with chachma, so it's much more like chachma than physical sight, right? It's much more like that intuitive grasp of a concept is the way the soul sees above. And when it sees, it doesn't see things external to itself. It sees realities within itself because it's connected to all things. All things that there are to see, the soul is able to see within itself. This whole concept that sight can become an externalized sense comes with incarnation, Chassidus would tell you. This is just one example of many, many possible examples, right?
So you're saying that the soul comes down 100% or only partially?
It's a complicated question. We say only certain levels of the soul come down, but practically speaking, in terms of our day-to-day reality, the soul comes down into the body. In other words, the soul's ability to see as it does above is strictly curtailed by the body, and the body only lets the most external aspect of what it means to see have effect in this reality, and that's what physical sight is, right? Through the actual eyeball, which affects what you see, colors what you see, etc., right? More or less. Or if you want to say sight is chachma, then the physical brain, which of course as well, all thinking depends on the structure of the brain and works with the limitations of the physical brain. But what's the point of this whole discussion? The point of this whole discussion is that the soul, in its deepest point, when the soul is in the inner, the more, let's put it this way, the more in the inner world you go, the less things are defined by two defined things encountering each other. Two defined things encountering each other can only happen because this has become one thing, the other thing has become another, and now they're in some kind of interaction, right? But we know that the root of all things is in the divine self, is in God, right? Where there are no multiple things to have external interaction with each other, right? Therefore, there's a concept called a levush, which is a garment. A garment means that the inner reality of the thing is able to extend outward and interface with external realities. The inner truths of the thing, in the inner world, the true inner world, are able to come down and interact externally. Just like the soul, as it is up above, is able to come down into this world and see external physical objects, right? How is that possible? Only through an interface. There needs to be some kind of intermediary. In the case of the soul, it's the body, right? Where it's able to be enclosed within the thing. This is what we mean by enclothing, right? And the clothing serves as the interface, allowing the inner world to not just remain inner, but to express outer. So what I didn't understand, I never even finished the sentence, going all the way back. What they never told me when I first started learning Chassidus, is that the metaphor of actual clothing, like a hand in a glove, for example, is not the metaphor of a garment. That's not what we mean by garment. That's not why it's called that. It's not called a garment because the soul goes into some external thing, which is then its clothing, right, which fits it and is its clothing. That's not really the point. What we call garments, thought, speech, and action, right, are part of the soul. They're also parts of the soul. They're not an external thing coming from the outside in which it should be enclosed, right? What do we mean by garment? We fundamentally mean an interface. The soul, the godly soul, has an inner reality. It has intellect about God. It has emotions about God, right? But that inner reality is an inner reality. What if the godly soul wants to meet something else, right? So it's defined as intellect and emotion, right? So in other words, that just means there is a godly soul in this reality, in this world, right? It's you have intellect about God and emotions about God. So there is a godly soul that exists in terms of this world, in terms of the is of this world. There is a godly soul, right? But what about that godly soul actually having an external effect? And now we know what we mean by external, right? We don't mean physically external to the soul per se. As we're going to see, one of the garments is thought, and whereas thought, it's actually inside the soul itself. It's private, right? So we don't mean external, meaning in going out physically, as we would think about it in a simple sense, into the external world, right? But thought is a garment because thought is the soul interacting, right, where its edge meets other things. In this case, in the special case of thought, it has really to do with how it meets itself, because all things which are externalized also have a place where they touch themselves, which in this case is thought, right? It's a different. We'll get to maybe more philosophizing about that maybe a different time. Thought, speech, and action, the garments of the soul, are how the soul has relationships in the external world. Right? It's how the internal intellect and emotions of the soul, which are self-contained, which take place within the soul itself. And in fact, in chapter 3, as we discussed, it's actually the process of the soul's self-construction. It's actually the soul coming into its own existence, right? How can that existence then interact with an external object the way that the fully formed existence of the cup interacts with the fully formed existence of the table? And the answer is there has to be an interface. There has to be a spiritual interface. The spiritual interface is called a levush. The soul has embassies in the outside world, right? It has departments whose job are to deal with external things. In the godly soul, these are in the soul, these are called thought, speech, and action. And as we're going to read in the first lines of the 4th chapter, in the godly soul, it's thought, speech, and actions of Torah and mitzvahs. Because continuing the theme of the godly soul, everything is about God. Right? It has no thought, speech, or action about non-godly things. What are thought, speech, and action about godly things? There is knowing God with thought, which is the study of Torah. And there is thought, thinking, speaking, and acting in accordance with the will of God, which is mitzvahs. In that these things are the extension of godliness into a new lower place, which is the external reality. They're called garments not because they're an external thing the soul puts on, but because they're at the place of interface. That's why they're called garments, right? Just like where does the body interface with, when the body needs to survive in a world which has all the elements and all of these things, right? So how does the body survive? Among the elements, it survives by, at that place of interface, there's something called a garment, right? Because the garment is only an interface, this gives it all of its qualities that we're going to discuss in chapter 4. For example, it's very difficult, as we've discussed in the previous chapter, it's very difficult for a person to change their actual emotions, right? This was the experiment that's been brought up many times in this class, where our teacher in yeshiva told us to list all our favorite foods and all the most disgusting foods on 2 different sides of the page. Then he said, if I gave you $10 million, could you eat the foods that disgust you? And everyone said yes. The reason you can do things, even though they disgust you, is because it's only a garment. It's only an interface, right? Whereas he said, what if I gave you $10 million to switch the 2 lists, love the things you hate and hate the things you love? It's immediately much more difficult. What makes it more difficult? Because it's not a levush, it's not a garment, it's not at the level of interface, it's at the level of the actual contours of the self, the actual shape of the neshama itself, its actual being, what it is, right? And then what it is, it's very difficult to change things. Sometimes the Rebbe says even impossible. Sometimes it's impossible to change the midas, the emotive qualities of the soul. The actual what you love and what you hate. So it's called a garment, not because it's actually made of something other than the soul. One of the reasons it's called a garment is because you can exchange it easily. You can stop acting at will pretty much instantaneously because it's an interface, right? You're not changing what you are. You're just changing what sticks out in the external world, right? Which we have a lot of control over because it's only a garment. It's only an interface. It's a very minor thing relative to the reality of the soul. You can stop acting. You can stop speaking, even if you're Jewish, and even though Chassidus says you can't stop thinking, because thinking is a constant flow from the soul, the person who's alive always has some thought, right? Chassidus would claim. Maybe some interesting exploration to do in that concept, but a person, Chassidus would say, could always choose what they think, at least, right? Even if you can't control that you think, you can definitely control what you think. And I'll just close with this idea. We'll continue, God willing, with all this next week and start reading, God willing, next week. And I'll just close with this idea that it's very interesting that in a fundamental guide to serving God in Judaism, the first time Torah and mitzvahs really show up is in chapter 4. Yeah? Some people would say, like for example, the first Rashi on the Torah, that the entire purpose of all Torah is Torah and mitzvahs. You have to learn Torah and you have to do mitzvahs. That's what a Jew's here for. That's what a Jew's here to do, right? So, what took you so long to get to chapter 4 to start talking about Torah and mitzvahs? And the answer is that this whole tension is fundamental to understanding the Alter Rebbe's view of Judaism. Because Chassidus would tell you, the Alter Rebbe would tell you, the Baal Shem Tov would tell you, the Arizal would tell you, that Judaism is first what you are, and only then what you do. The Jew's connection with God is what you are, not what you do, right? As we discussed in chapter 2. The connection with God is a what you are issue, and it can never be changed, ultimately, right? What you do is more of a superficial thing. That's what would seem logical, right? On the other hand, the entire Torah revolves around action, of course, right? If you have the famous example, the simple example that demonstrates this is if you have someone that fully and completely understands the laws of tefillin and loves God in the way that tefillin dictates, and has a full understanding of the deep mystical notion of tefillin, but never actually puts leather boxes on his arm, he never fulfills the mitzvah. Whereas some guy you meet on the street who doesn't know anything about anything, just found out he was Jewish 3 seconds ago, he puts the leather boxes on his arm, and he's actually fulfilling the mitzvah of tefillin. Right? He's actually doing it. And in Judaism, we say that the action is the main thing. Right? The action is primary. So the real question on the mystics, the real question on those who see mitzvahs and Torah as only issues of interface, right, rather than as issues of fundamental reality of connection to God. The Jew is perfectly connected to God without his Torah and mitzvahs, it would seem, right? Why then is the entire Judaism so focused on action? And doesn't that mean there's a fundamental tension between the mystical view, in which all things are ultimately one with God, and the traditional Jewish view, which says that action is the main thing? See the tension, right? Chapter 4, one of the themes of chapter 4 of Tanya is to resolve this tension. The Alter Rebbe is going to explain, on the contrary, how both are true. Torah and mitzvahs are the levushim of the soul. They're garments. They're fundamentally interaction. A Jew has a connection with God even without Torah and mitzvahs, fundamentally in the godly soul, right? However, this interaction is the most important thing at the same time. This is really a grand theme of Tanya and of Chassidus and of the Alter Rebbe. So one of the major goals of chapter 4 of Tanya is to explain how both of these things are true, that the fundamental connection to God is essential, the inner world is the fundamental reality, right? But that inner world should come into interface and come into interaction externally is nevertheless the purpose of the entire Judaism and the fundamental pole and tent pole of all of Yiddishkeit and all of Judaism. And we're going to, God willing, next week, we'll move more towards an understanding of how this can be the case. To be continued.